received of the estate, this Lady Day, in the year of our Lord 1819, the wages and board owing to the undermentioned persons of the household of Rayshome Hall in the county of Westmoreland, the same to be entered fair and carried forward. Item, to Mrs. Tamsin Brooke, housekeeper, £22 the year, paid. Item, to John Aldous, butler, £30 the year, paid. Item, to the cook, the laundry-maid, the 2 housemaids, the boy. And then, last upon the page, written in the same patient ink and the same patient hand, in a column that asked for nothing, Item, to Miss Honora Rayshome, for the keeping of the books, and the writing of the letters, and the ordering of the still room, no wage set down, board only. She was 29 years of age. She had kept that account book since she was 16, and she had written that line herself every Lady Day for 13 years in her own father's house, because no one had ever told her she was anything but a servant in it, and because the man who could have told her otherwise was her father, and her father had never once said the word daughter where another soul might hear it. She did not weep when she wrote it. She had learned long before that weeping over a ledger smudged the ink, and a smudged ledger had to be done again, and doing it again wasted a candle, and a candle was 4 pence. So she had taught her grief to wait until the page was dry. This is a story about a woman who taught her grief to wait so long and so well that she very nearly forgot it was waiting at all, until a stranger in mourning black opened that same book, found the line where her name sat among the wages, and read it aloud in a voice that did not understand what it was reading, and so read it the way it was truly meant, as though Miss Honora Rayshome were a person, and not a column. And in the reading of one line, on one cold, pale, grey morning, a thing that had been settled and silent for 13 years came quietly, terribly, beautifully undone. But that is the end of the first part, and we are at the beginning, where it is 6:30 in the morning on the 14th of February, 1819, 3 days after the old master of Rayshome had died in his bed without saying anything to anyone, and the house is very cold, and Honora is already awake, because Honora was always already awake. She woke, as she had woken every morning of her life that she could remember, to the particular quality of the dark that belonged to the hour before the maids came down. It was a dark she knew the way other women knew a face. She could have told you, with her eyes still shut, exactly how far the fire in the small grate of her room had sunk, and whether the wind had come round in the night to the east, where it found the gap under the north passage door that no one had ever mended, because mending it would have cost a joiner 2 shillings and a half day. And the old master did not care to spend 2 shillings on a passage only the servants used. She lay a moment under the warm blanket and listened to the house. A great house speaks to the one who keeps its books, and Honora had learned its whole language, the settling of the old timbers as the night cold left them, the drip from the leaderhead that meant the gutter wanted clearing, the small complaint of the back stair on the 7th tread that no weight could silence. She knew the dairy had not been scolded out properly the evening before, because she had heard the cook send the boy off too early, and she made a note of it in the part of her mind that kept notes, to be entered later, fair, and carried forward. Then she rose, because there was no profit in lying still, and a fire to be lit, and the day's accounts to begin before the household stirred, and because the old master was 3 days dead, and there was a great deal to be set in order before the new one came. For the new one was coming. That was the thing that lay over the whole house, that February like a second, colder frost. The old master, Miss Silas Raysham, who had owned the Hall and its 1,100 acres and its lead money from the Fells for 40 years, had died on the 11th, in the night, with his face turned to the wall. And the only word anyone had heard him say in his last fever was a name no one in the house could place. A woman's name, spoken twice, low. He had left no son. He had left no wife. The lady of the Hall had died so long ago that even Mrs. Brooke, 40 years in service there, spoke of her only as a kind of weather that had once passed over the place. He had left, the steward said, the estate entire to his nephew, a man none of them had ever seen. A Mr. No. The steward corrected himself, folding the letter very carefully, His Grace. For the nephew, by a chain of deaths in another branch that no one at Raysham had thought to follow, had 3 years since become the Duke of Carrow, and it was the Duke of Carrow who would arrive, by his man of business's letter on the morning of the 17th, to take possession of Raysham Hall and everything that was in it. Everything that was in it. Honora, kneeling at the small grate, blowing the embers patiently back to life as she had 1,000 mornings, turned that phrase over in her mind the way she turned a coin she suspected of being clipped. The phrase did not, anywhere in any of its words, make room for her. She was not in the will. She had copied the will fair herself 2 years ago at her father's dictation in this very hand, and had written every legacy down, £20 to the church for the poor of the parish, the silver-headed cane to the steward, the good bay mare to the doctor, and had come at last to the residue. The house and the lands and all that they contained, and had written the nephew's name, and had not once, in all those careful clauses, found her own. She had set down the ink that disinherited her without the ink ever knowing what it did, and blotted it, and carried it forward, because that was her office. She kept the books. She did not appear in them, except as that one line, no wage set down, board only, which was not an inheritance but the opposite of one. The record of a thing given for nothing and expected for nothing, year upon year, a debt the house owed her that the house would never, by its own reckoning, admit it owed. She did not let herself think about what would become of her after the 17th. She had a rule about that. There were 2 kinds of trouble in the world. The kind a person could do something about before breakfast, and the kind a person could not. And the only sane thing was to spend one's whole strength on the first, and give the second not one single grain until it arrived at the door. The new Duke arriving was the second kind. Until then there was a fire to be got up, and the muniment room to be set straight, and a mourning household to be fed and warmed and kept from talk, and these were the first kind, and she gave herself to them wholly. When the fire had caught, she washed in the cold water from the ewer, and dressed in the grey stuff gown that was the better of her 2, and pinned her hair as plainly as a Quakeress, though she was no Quaker, and went down the back stair, avoiding the 7th tread out of long courtesy to the sleeping-house, and let herself into the still room, and lit her own candle from the kitchen rushlight, and sat down at the high desk that had been her station since she was a girl of 16, and opened the great account book of the House of Raysham to the place she had left it the night before, and began the day. Here we must understand the still room, and the desk in it, and the book upon the desk, because they were, between them, very nearly the whole of Honora Raysham's known world. The still room lay at the cold north end of the house, between the kitchen and the muniment passage, a long, low chamber with a stone-flagged floor, and it had been in the old lady's day. A place of waters and cordials and dried herbs hung in bunches from the beams. Some of those bunches hung there yet, grey ghosts of lavender and rue gone to dust, that Honora had never had the heart to take down. But in her own time it had become something else. something that no one had decided, and that had simply grown, the way ivy grows, around the fact of her. It had become the place where the house thought. Here were the account books, the great current one and the dozen old ones bound in cracked vellum. Here were the letter books, into which she copied, fair, every letter that went out over the old master's name, for he had not in his last 10 years cared to write his own, but had dictated to her, walking up and down with his hands behind his back, and she had turned his rough, growling sentences into the cool, correct prose the world believed to be his. Here, in short, was the whole memory of Raysham Hall, kept in one hand, and the hand was hers. She had not been born to it. That was a thing she knew without ever having been told it in words, the way a child knows the shape of a secret long before it can name the secret. She had been born. She knew this much. From the parish register she had once looked into on a pretext, her heart going like a hare's, in the spring of 1789, and christened Honora, mother's name left curiously blank, and written under it in a smaller hand, a base child of the parish, taken in at the Hall. 6 words. She had read them once, at 12 years old, standing on a stool in the cold vestry while the clerk's back was turned, and had got down and closed the register and gone out into the churchyard and been quietly, thoroughly sick behind the yew, and then wiped her mouth and gone home and said nothing. To anyone, ever, she had only once let herself put the two things side by side. The blank where a mother's name should be, and the fact that the old master, hard as a gatepost to every living soul, had nonetheless kept her, fed her, taught her her letters and figures by his own impatient instruction, and let her grow up under his roof answering to no one but himself. She had looked, once, in the dark, at the shape those two things made. And the shape was a word she did not dare say even inside her own skull, and so she had taken them apart again and locked them in separate drawers of herself and gone on keeping the books. Because here is the thing that must be plainly said about Honora Raysham, so that everything which comes after may be understood. She had decided, very young, that she would not want. Wanting was the one extravagance the house could not afford her, and so she had given it up the way other women gave up sugar in Lent, only she had given it up for life. She did not want a wage, though she earned 1 10 times over. She did not want the name that was almost certainly hers. She did not want the small, warm, ordinary things, a husband, a hearth of her own, a child to teach her letters to that other women of 9 and 20 had or grieved the lack of. She had looked at the whole great hungry country of wanting when she was about 17 and drawn a clean line around the edge of it and said, in effect, not for me, and turned her back and taught her grief to wait on the far side of that line and kept the books. It is a thing women learned to do, in that age and in ours, and it is a quieter sort of courage than the kind that gets into songs, and it costs more, and it is the courage this whole story is about. So she sat at her high desk on the 14th of February, with the dead lavender hanging grey above her and her own breath showing faint in the candlelight, and she worked. She entered the day's disbursements, fair and carried forward. She made a list, in her small, even hand, of what must be done before the 17th, the great chamber aired, and the bed made up. For the Duke would lie in his uncle's room as was proper, the muniment room set in order, every deed and lease and rental laid ready for his solicitor. For a careful new master would want to know at once what he had come into, the servants' wages reckoned to the quarter day, and the money set by, so that whatever else the new master found wanting he should not find the household in arrears or in confusion. She would hand him a house in perfect order, It was the one gift she had to give, and she would give it, and then she would go. For she had, by the 14th, already privately decided that she would go. Not be turned out go, of her own asking, with dignity, before anyone had the chance to wonder aloud what was to be done about the odd grey woman in the still room, who had no place in the will and no wage in the book, and no name the register would own to in daylight. She would put the house in order, and on the morning the Duke came she would ask, quietly, for a fortnight's grace and a character, and take the mail coach south, where no one knew that a child had once been taken in at Rayshome Hall, and offer herself to some other house as a keeper of accounts, and teach her grief in the new place to go on waiting, as it had waited here. She had even begun in her mind to compose the character she would have, to ask the steward to write for her, since there was no master left to write it, and had got as far as a respectable and trustworthy person, well skilled in the keeping of household accounts, before the unfairness of having to write the testimonial to her own worth in another man's voice, as she had written everything for 13 years in another man's voice, rose up in her so hot that she had to put down the pen and sit very still with her hands flat on the cold desk until it passed. It passed. Most things passed, if you sat still enough. She picked the pen up again. She had not allowed herself to wonder what the new Duke would be like, because wondering was a cousin of wanting and lived on the wrong side of her line. But the house wondered for her, as a house full of frightened servants will. Mrs. Brooke, who had a soft spot for Honora that she expressed entirely in extra bread and never in words, came in twice that morning on small pretexts and stood by the still-room fire saying she had heard the Duke of Carrow was a hard man, a soldier, wounded abroad, come home with a face like a closed door, that he turned off servants by the dozen. John Aldous the butler said, on the contrary, that his Grace was a man of the first fashion who would find a north country house like Rayshome beneath him and sell it within the year to the lead company and turn them all onto the fells. The cook said only, darkly, that dukes were dukes, and the likes of us would suffer for it, which was not information, but was, Honora thought. Very probably the truth. She listened to all of it, fair, and carried none of it forward, and kept the books. And the days went down, the 14th and the 15th and the 16th, cold and pale and grey, the house growing cleaner and quieter and more dreadfully ready by the hour, until everything that could be set in order had been set in order. And the great chamber was aired, and the muniment room laid ready, and the books fair to the last farthing, and there was nothing left for Honora to do but the one thing she had been putting off, which was to make up the final account, the account of herself, and decide exactly what she would carry away in her box when she went. She did it that night, late, in the still room, by a single candle, with the house asleep around her and the wind come round to the east as she had known it would. She set out on the desk everything she owned in the world, which did not take long. 2 gowns, the grey she wore, and a brown. A shawl. A work-box that had been the old lady's. A small store of money, £11, 3 shillings and 4pence, saved farthing by farthing over 13 years out of the tiny sums the old master let her keep back from the marketing, which was the whole of her fortune and her freedom both. A Bible. A book of recipes for waters and cordials in the old lady's hand, that she had no right to and meant to take anyway, and was ashamed of meaning to, and meant to all the same. And one thing more, the only thing more, which she took now from the back of the desk's lowest drawer where it had lain for 13 years, and unwrapped from its square of flannel, and held to the candle. It was a child's coral, a teething coral, the sort a wealthy infant is given. A length of polished red coral set in a worn silver handle with a ring of small silver bells, all of them long since gone dumb. It had been hers. She knew it because Mrs. Brooke, who had been a young undermaid the spring Honora was born, had told her so once, only once, in a low, frightened voice that forbade any question, that this had been about the baby's neck the night she was brought into the hall, and that the old master had taken it and looked at it a long while and given it back, and said it was to be kept. A teething coral set in silver was not the gift of the parish. The parish did not give its base children polished coral. Someone had given it, someone with money and a reason. Honora had known this for 13 years and locked it, like everything else, in a drawer of herself. And now, on the night before the new Duke came, she took it out and looked at it in the candlelight. The dumb bells and the red coral worn pale at one end, where some child she could not remember being had once bitten down on it in the dark. She wrapped it again in its flannel and put it in the box, on top of the £11 and the Bible and the stolen Book of Waters. And then she sat a while in the dark with her hands folded and let her grief come up out of the far side of the line, just once, just for that one night, since she was going away and might as well. And she did not weep, because weeping smudged the ink even when there was no ink, but she sat with it, the great patient grief she had taught to wait, and let it sit with her. And the wind went on in the east, and the candle burned down, and tomorrow the Duke of Carrow would come to take possession of everything that was in the house. Everything that was in it. She blew out the candle and went up the back stair in the dark, avoiding the seventh tread, and lay down in her clothes upon the worn blanket, and did not sleep, and waited for the morning that would change, though she could not have begun to imagine how, the entire reckoning of her life. The 17th of February came up cold and pale grey and very still, the kind of North Country winter morning that has no sun in it at all, only a slow lightening of the cloud from charcoal to ash to the colour of a pewter plate, so that one could not have said at what minute the night had ended and the day begun. Honora was down before 6, as always, and had her own fire, and the kitchen fire and the great hall fire all drawing before the first maid was abroad, because she had reasoned that a house to be inspected by its new owner ought at the very least to be a warm one, and warmth cost only the labour of her own 2 hands and the wood that was already cut. She went through the rooms in the grey half-light, setting small things straight that were already straight, the way a person does when the body must be doing something or the mind will start to want. And she found the household, when it came down, already infected with that brittle, over-polished cheerfulness that frightened people put on, the maids whispering and dropping things. John Aldous, in his second-best black misses, Brooke read about the eyes and continually counting the spoons. Honora moved among them quietly, settling this one and steadying that, sending the boy out to watch the Kendal Road from the paddock wall and come running the moment he saw a carriage, and all the while keeping, in the cool back part of her mind, her own private account of the morning. What was done? What remained? And how long it would yet be before the thing she dreaded came up the avenue under the dripping limes. She had thought she was ready. She had set every item of the house in order and every item of herself in order, and composed her small, dignified request for a fortnight's grace, and believed she had taken the full measure of what the day would cost her, and had the price ready in her hand. She was wrong, of course. We are always wrong about that. The things that undo us never come up the avenue we are watching. They come in at the side door, quietly, in morning black, and lay a hand upon the one possession we did not think to guard, because we had never once imagined it could be taken, or worse, that it could be given back. The boy came running a little before 11. Honora was in the muniment room when she heard him, his boots loud on the flags and his voice cracking on the word carriage. And she set down the bundle of leases she had been squaring, and squared them once more, though they were already square, and stood a moment with both hands flat upon the cold deal table, and breathed. Then she went out into the great hall, where the household was assembling itself into the ragged double line that forms to receive a master, and she did not take her place among them. Because she did not know any more what her place among them was, she stood instead a little apart, in the shadow of the great stair, where the keeper of the books had always stood, half in attendance and half forgotten, and watched John Aldous draw the great door open upon the pale grey morning, and the cold come in. The carriage was a travelling chariot, mud to the axle, plain and very good, with no arms painted on the door, which told Honora more about the new Duke in one glance than all the kitchen's chatter had in 3 days. For a vain man advertises, and a careful man does not. A servant got down, and then the solicitor, a spare grey man with a dispatch box who looked at the house the way a surgeon looks at a patient. And then, last, unhurried, a tall man in a long dark travelling coat stepped down onto the gravel and stood looking up at the house that was now his, and that was the Duke of Carrow. He was not what the kitchen had drawn. He was perhaps 35, dark, with the weathered, pared-down look of a man who had spent years out of doors and out of England, and there was a stillness in his face like a closed door. But Honora, who had spent her life reading faces for what they did not say, saw at once it was not the closed door of hardness, but of a man holding something heavy very level so as not to spill it. He moved a little stiffly on the left side, the old wound the kitchen had whispered of, and carried no cane, and would plainly rather have died than lean on one. He took the house in slowly, the long grey front and the dripping limes and the row of frightened servants, and then he came in, and put off his hat, and spoke, and his voice was low and level, and went all the way to the back of the hall without his seeming to raise it at all. He said the proper things, and few of them, that he was sorry to come among them on so sad an occasion, that he had not had the honour of knowing his late uncle, that he wished nothing in the household disturbed, and everyone should go on, for the present, exactly as before, while matters were looked into. He did not smile, and he did not threaten, and he did not make a speech. He simply set the household's terror down a notch by the plain levelness of him, the way you quiet a frightened horse, and Honora, watching from the shadow of the stair, felt against her own will a small, unwilling respect form in her, and noted it, and locked it in a drawer, because respect too was a cousin of wanting and lived on the wrong side of the line. Then John Aldous, bowing, began to present the upper servants, and the Duke inclined his head a precise civil half-inch to each, and his eye went down the line and came, as it was bound to come, to the place where the line broke off and the shadow of the stair began, and to the grey plain. Still woman standing in that shadow who belonged to no part of the line at all, and he paused, and he looked at her, and he said to Aldous, but with his eyes on her, "And this lady?" And there it was. The whole of Honora's careful mourning, the whole of her careful 13 years, came down to that small, dreadful question, and the silence after it, in which she understood, with the swift, cold completeness of a fall on ice, that no one in the room knew how to answer it. Aldous's mouth opened and shut. Mrs. Brooke's hands went to her apron, for there was no word in the household's vocabulary for what Honora was, not servant, for she took no wage and gave orders the butler obeyed, not family, for she sat at no table and bore, in daylight, no name, not guess, not poor relation, not anything that could be said aloud in a cold hall to a duke. She was the line at the bottom of the page that asked for nothing, and rather than let the good frightened souls who had been kind to her in the only ways they dared stand there shamed and stammering before their new master, Honora did the thing she had spent her whole life learning to do, which was to step quietly forward and spare everyone the cost of her by paying it herself. "I keep the household accounts, Your Grace," she said. Her voice was low and very even, the voice she had made for herself out of 13 years of being no one, a voice with all the wanting filed off it. "And the letter books, and the still room. Everything is in order against your inspection. If your Grace's solicitor will tell me what he wishes to see, it shall be laid before him within the hour." The Duke looked at her for a moment longer than was usual, the closed door of his face not opening, but seeming, somehow, to be listening behind itself. Then he inclined his head to her the same precise half-inch he had given the housekeeper and the butler, no less and no more, and said only, "Thank you. We shall begin with the muniments, when you are ready," and turned away to be shown to his uncle's room. And Honora let out a breath she had not known she was holding, and thought that the worst of it was over, and that she had got through the meeting with her dignity whole and her secret safe, and that she would put the muniments before the grey solicitor and the books before the Duke and the house in his hands, and ask her fortnight's grace, and go. She did not know yet about the household book. She did not know that the grey solicitor, going through the muniment room that afternoon with the Duke at his shoulder, would come at last upon the great current account book in Honora's own fair hand, and open it to show his Grace the admirable order in which the late Mr. Rayshome's affairs had been kept, and turn, by the purest blind chance of where a book falls open, to the page of the household wages for the last Lady Day, and that the Duke of Carrow, who read everything slowly and to the end because that was the kind of man the years abroad had made of him, would run his eye down that column of names and sums to the last line of it. The line in the same patient ink that asked for nothing, and read it aloud, not understanding what he read, and so reading it true, item to Miss Honora Rayshome, for the keeping of the books and the writing of the letters and the ordering of the still room, no wage set down, board only. She did not know that he would stop at that and read it again, and then a third time, slower, that he would ask the solicitor, in a voice gone suddenly and dangerously quiet, what this meant. This woman who bore the name of the family and the office of a steward and the wage of a beggar, and that Mrs. Brooke, sent for, white to the lips, would be able to tell him only a very little. A child brought to the hall in the spring of '89, taken in, kept, never owned, given a teething coral of red coral and silver that no parish ever gave, and that the very little she could tell would be enough, in a man who read everything to the end, to begin a question the whole of Rayshome had spent 13 years agreeing never to ask. She knew only that the morning she had dreaded had come and very nearly gone, and that she had survived it, and that tomorrow she would ask her Grace and her character and go south on the mail coach to keep some other family's books, and teach her grief, in the new place, to go on waiting. She was wrong about that too. After 13 patient years the grief was, though she did not yet know it, about to be sent for, and answered, and asked at last, by a stranger in mourning black who did not know what he was reading, to come up out of the far side of the line and be counted, fair, and carried forward into a reckoning no one in that cold grey house could yet have begun to imagine. The solicitor's name was Mr. Penhallow, and he was the sort of dry, exact, incorruptible man whom careful people keep about them precisely because he has no imagination and therefore no appetite, and it was Mr. Penhallow who undid Honora, with the best will in the world and with praise. They had been 3 hours in the muniment room that first afternoon, the Duke and his man of business, going methodically through the presses and the deed boxes and the long runs of receipted bills, and Honora had laid it all before them and then withdrawn, as was proper, to the window seat at the far end of the room, where she sat very straight, with her hands folded, and answered, when she was asked, in as few words as the question allowed. She had thought herself safe there. She had thought the danger was the looking at, the standing in the line, the dreadful question in the hall, and that being now reduced again to a voice that answered from a window, she was returned to her natural element, which was the margin, the place off the page. But Mr. Penhallow was a man who admired good work the way another man admires a good horse, helplessly and aloud, and when he came at last to the great current account book, and opened it and saw what was in it, the years of entries in one unwavering hand, the cross-references, the little marginal notes that turned a column of figures into a history, the way every shilling could be walked from the day it came into the house to the day it left, he could not keep the pleasure out of his dry voice, and he turned the book round upon the table so that it faced the Duke, and said, "Your Grace will not often see accounts kept so. Look here, and here. There is not a great house in the county whose books are kept to this. Whoever has had the doing of this has the head of a chancery clerk and the patience of a saint, and your Grace would do very ill to lose them." And he turned, smiling his dry approving smile, to the window where Honora sat, and the Duke's eyes followed his, and Honora felt the floor of her careful life tilt very slowly beneath her, because she saw what was about to happen the half-second before it happened, and could no more stop it than she could stop the clock. But the Duke drew the book toward him and looked down at it with the grave thoroughness he gave to everything, and he did not skim it as a great man skims a thing handed up to him to be admired. He read it. He read down the page that lay open, which was a page of household disbursements, and then he turned, idly, the leaf, to where the wages were set down for the last Lady Day, the long fair column of the household's names and what each was paid, so much to John Aldous the butler, so much to Mrs. Brooke, so much to the cook and the grooms and the maids, and the boy who turned the spit. Each name and each sum in Honora's own patient ink, and he read it all the way down, because he was a man who finished what he began, down to the very last line of the column, and the last line of the column, written in the same hand that had written all the rest, in the same ink, with the same evenness, asking, as it had always asked, for nothing, said, item, to Miss Honora Raychalmy, for the keeping of the books, the writing of the letters, and the ordering of the still room, no wage set down, board only. And the Duke of Carrow read it aloud. He read it the way one reads aloud the last line of a column one has been reading down, half to himself, to close the count, and to Miss Honora Raychalmy, for the keeping of the books, the writing of the letters, and the ordering of the still room, no wage set down, board only, and because he did not understand it, because he had no notion in the world of what it meant or whom it named, he read it plainly, without flinching, without the careful drop of the voice that every soul in that house had learned to give the matter, and so he read it true. The bare, cruel arithmetic of it laid out in his low, even voice in the cold afternoon light. A woman who bore the family's name and did a steward's whole work and was paid the wage of a beggar, which is to say, no wage at all. Then he stopped. She watched him stop. She watched him come to the end of the line and go still, in the particular way she had already learned to read in him. The stillness of a man holding something level, and then she watched him go back and read it again, his eyes moving, his lips not, and then a third time, slower than the second, and she sat in the window with her hands folded in her lap and her face composed into the grey nothing she had made of it over 13 years, and waited for the thing she had spent 13 years arranging never to be asked. "Penhallow," said the Duke at last, and his voice had changed. It had gone quiet, but it was a different quiet, the quiet that comes down over a level country before weather. What does this mean? It was not quite a question. Mr. Penhallow, who had not been reading over his shoulder and who took the book back and found the line and read it, lost a little of his dryness for the first time that day. "It means," he said slowly, "Your Grace, that someone of the family's name has kept this house's books for—" He turned back leaf by leaf, his finger going up the years, "for a very long while, and has been entered each Lady Day for no wage. Board only." He looked up. "It is not regular. A servant is paid or is not a servant. A relation does not appear in the wage book at all. This is," and the dry man stopped, because he had been about to say "this is neither," and had understood, a beat too late, that there was a living woman sitting in the window not 12 feet from him, to whom neither was the whole and only truth of her life. The Duke turned in his chair. He did not do it quickly. He turned and he looked down the long room to the window seat where Honora sat. And for the first time since he had come into the house his closed face was, very slightly, open, not with pity, which she could have borne and despised, and not with the curiosity of a man who has found a freak, which she had armoured herself against for years, but with something graver and more dangerous than either, the plain arrested attention of a man who has read a line he does not understand and will not now be able to leave it alone. He said, "Miss Rachel, Your Grace," she said from the window, "is this your hand?" "It is, Your Grace. You wrote this line. I keep the wage book, Your Grace," she said. "I enter every name in it, mine among them." And she had meant it to close the matter, to make of it a clerk's small dull fact. "I keep the book. The book includes the keeper. There is nothing here." But she heard, even as she said it, how it did the opposite, how a woman who enters her own name in a wage book each year, in her own hand, against no wage, has done a thing so strange and so steadily borne that no plain account of it can make it ordinary, and she saw in his face that he heard it too. He did not press her then. That was the thing about him she would have a long time to learn, and would learn first in that room, that he did not press where pressing would shame. He looked at her another moment, and then he inclined his head, the same grave half-inch, and turned back to the table and said, "Thank you, Miss Rayshome. That will be all, for the present," and let her go, and she rose, and curtsied, and went out of the muniment room with her back straight and her step even, and got down the corridor and round the turn of it before she had to put her hand flat against the cold panelling and stand a moment with her eyes shut, because the line at the bottom of the page had been read aloud at last by the one person in England who had not known he must not read it. And she understood with the same cold, falling certainty she had felt in the hall that the long, careful safety of being no one was over, and that being no one had been, God forgive her, a kind of safety, and that she did not at all know how to be anyone else. He sent for Mrs. Brooke that evening. Honora did not see it. She had it after, in pieces, from the housekeeper herself, who came to the still room when it was done with her colour gone, and sat down without being asked, which she had never done in her life, and said, "He asked me, Honora, he asked me straight out, and I could not, God help me, child, I never could lie to save myself," and there was that in his face, and stopped, and pressed her knuckles to her mouth. The Duke had had her brought to the small parlour and had stood her by the fire, not unkindly, and had asked her, in that low-level voice, what she knew of Miss Rayshorn, how the lady came to be in the house, whose child she was, why she bore the name and not the place. And Mrs. Brooke, who had been in the house since before Honora came to it and loved her in the fierce, helpless way of a woman with no children of her own, had told him the little she truly knew, which was little enough, and the truth, because she had never in her life learned the trick of telling anything else. She had told him that in the spring of the year 89, late when the lanes were still bad, a child had been brought to the hall of a wet evening, brought by whom she had never been told, for old master had had the bringing of it kept from the household, and only Mrs. Brooke, then a young upper housemaid, had been called to take the child and warm it and find it a bed. That the child was a girl of perhaps 3 or 4 years, well-clad, clean, not a parish child nor a beggar's, with the look of having been cared for, that she came with no paper, no letter, no name said aloud, only that old master had stood over the cradle they made up that first night with a face Mrs. Brooke had never seen on him before or since, and had said, when she asked him what the child was to be called, only Rayshorn. She is to be called Rayshorn, and nothing else, not Miss, not his ward, not his anything, and had turned and gone out, and that thereafter the child was simply in the house, fed, taught her letters, taught her work, never beaten, never owned, growing up into the grey, quiet woman she was now, kept and unkept, named and unnamed. The keeper of a house that had never once, in all the years, called her kin, and she had told him of the quarrel. For there had been one thing the child came with, Mrs. Brooke said, one only, sewn, when they undressed her that first night, into the hem of her little petticoat, where a careful hand had hidden it, a child's teething rattle, a costly one. A bar of smooth red coral, set in a handle of worked silver with little bells, the kind of thing a christening brings in a family with money and a name to keep, and never, never the kind of thing a parish gives, or a poor woman owns, or a foundling comes by honestly. Mrs. Brooke had taken it to old master, thinking it must be his to keep, and he had looked at it a long moment in his hand, and his face had done the thing it did at the cradle, and he had given it back to her and said, let her keep it. Say nothing of it. It is hers. And that was all, and the child had kept it, all her life, and Mrs. Brooke supposed she had it still, and that it was the only thing in the world that said the grey woman in the still room had once been somebody's, placed where she was by someone with money and a reason and a hand careful enough to sew silver into a child's hem against the day it might be wanted. And that is all I know, Mrs. Brooke had said to him, by the fire, with her hands shaking, and it is all anyone in this house knows, your grace, and we have all of us learned not to ask, because old master would not be asked, and because. And here she had faltered, and then said the rest, because she could not help it, because she has made herself so small, your grace, so as to be no trouble to anyone, that to ask is like to wake a person who has at last got to sleep after a long pain, and one is afraid of what one wakes. And the Duke had been quiet a long time, looking into the fire, and had then thanked her, gravely, and let her go, and that was what Mrs. Brooke brought down to the still room, white and undone, and laid before Honora, and the two women sat together in the warm herb, smelling dark a long while, and said very little, because there was very little to say that had not already cost too much to say. It was the next morning that Honora went to the Duke to ask for her leave to go, and that he forbade it. She had dressed with care for it, in the better of her 2 grey gowns, and had her little speech by heart, the speech she had made and remade through a sleepless night, that she was very sensible of His Grace's goodness in suffering the household to go on undisturbed, that she had thought it right to set everything in order against his coming, and trusted He found it so. That she would ask of His Grace only 2 things: a fortnight's grace to make all clear to whomever He appointed in her place, and a character, that she might seek a situation elsewhere, that she had a mind to go south, where she was not known, and would trouble no one. She had it word perfect. She believed it to be the most sensible speech in the world, the only sensible speech, the natural and proper closing of an account, and she went up to the South Library where he had taken to sitting of a morning with his uncle's papers, and was admitted, and stood before him, and said it, all of it, in her low, even voice with the wanting filed off, to the end. He heard her out. He always heard one out. She would come to know that, as the deepest thing in him, the patience that had been ground into him somewhere far away and hard. He sat behind the wide table with the grey light on him and his hands still upon the papers, and he let her come to the very end of her sensible speech, and the silence after it, and then he said, "No." She had not prepared for no. She had prepared for every kind of yes, the cold yes, the relieved yes, the kindly meant yes with a little purse in it that she would have had to refuse, but not for the single flat word, low, level, final, set down between them on the table like a stone. "Your Grace," she said. "You will not go south on the mail coach," he said, "to keep some stranger's books and be no one in another cold house, because there is a line in your own hand in my account book that I do not understand, and I do not let things I do not understand walk out of my door of a Tuesday morning, never to be asked again." He rose then, and came round the table, not toward her, but to the window, and stood looking out at the dripping limes with his back half to her, which she would also come to know was his way of giving a person room to have a face he was not watching. Miss Rayshorn. I have asked Mrs. Brooke what she knows, and she has told me, and it is little, and most of it is silence, and I find I cannot make the silence into sense. A child brought here in 89, given this family's name and no place in this family, kept 30 years and never owned, entered each year in a wage book for no wage. A coral that a parish does not give, a name my uncle would not have asked of him, and a household that learned not to ask it. That is not an account, Miss Rayshorn. That is the first line of one, with all the rest torn out. And I have spent a great many years in places where men's whole lives were the first line of an account with the rest torn out, and I have learned that you do not honour such a person by leaving the page blank. You honour them by reading to the end. "There may be no end to read, Your Grace," she said, very low. "There may be nothing but the blank. People are mislaid, children are left. It is no mystery, only a meanness, and the kindest thing is to let it lie." He turned at that and looked at her, and there was something in his weathered, closed face that she could not name and did not trust, because she had unlearned the names of such things. "Is that what you wish?" he said. "That it lie?" And there it was, the question under the question, the one no one had ever in 30 years thought to ask her, "What do you wish?" And she felt the long trained machinery of her whole self rise to meet it, to say what she had always said, that she wished nothing, that wanting lived on the wrong side of a line and she had put it there and meant it to stay, and she opened her mouth to say it. The smooth grey practised nothing of it. And to her own horror she found she could not quite get it out, because he had asked her plainly and was waiting plainly for the answer, and standing in front of his plane waiting the old smooth lie would not come, and so she said nothing at all, which was its own kind of answer, and saw that he heard it. "I will tell you what I mean to do," he said, after a moment, letting her off the question with a mercy she did not understand, "and you may help me or not, as you choose, but I will do it. I mean to have the muniment room searched, every box and letter book, for anything that touches the spring of '89. I mean to have the parish register looked into, at the church where you were, entered, or were not. I mean to learn whose child was brought to this house, and why a man who would not own her gave her his name. You need not assist me. You may go on keeping the books, or you may sit in the still room, or you may, if you truly wish it, take your fortnight and your character, though I tell you plainly I would count it a loss to the house. But you will not go, because you are afraid of what I might find. I have known a great many people afraid of what might be found, Miss Rasham, and I have buried some of them, and I have never once known the finding to be worse than the long living in the dark of not being found. Stay, let me read to the end of you. That is all I ask." It was, she thought afterward, the cruelest kind thing anyone had ever said to her, and she did not sleep that night either, and in the grey of the morning she got up and took her keys and went to the muniment room and began, herself to search, not because she had decided to hope, for she had not. She had decided nothing. She was far too well defended to decide a thing so dangerous as that. But because she could not bear the thought of his man Penhallow's dry, careful hands going through her dead world without her, and because, God help her, if there was an end to be read, she would rather read it first, alone, where no one could watch her face, and so she who had spent 13 years keeping the books set herself, at last to read them. She had been at it 4 days, and had found nothing but old dust and older debts when Mr. Caudle came. He came in a hired chaise on a raw bright morning, and he came smiling, which should have warned them, for the honest dead do not send smiling men. He was a stout, glossy, confidential person of perhaps 50, an attorney by his card, very well brushed, with small quick eyes set in a large, soft, agreeable face, and a way of holding his hat against his breast and inclining his upper body forward as he talked, that gave everything he said the air of a confidence offered for your own particular good. He asked for the Duke. He was kept waiting in the cold hall, where Honora, crossing it with a letter-book in her arms, had her first sight of him, and felt, without knowing why, the small animal lift of the hair on her neck that the body gives before the mind has the words, and he watched her cross the hall with his small, quick eyes, and smiled at her, and she did not like his smile, and went on. He was an hour with the Duke. What passed she had again in pieces, some from Penhallow, who was present and came out of it grey with a controlled disgust, and some, later and worse, from the thing itself as it unfolded. Mr. Caudle, it appeared, had come on behalf of a client whose name he was not, for the moment, at liberty to disclose, who had, he said, a prior interest in the Rasham estate, a settlement, an old arrangement of the late Mr. Rasham's, of which his Grace, coming new and from abroad, could not be expected to know, but which Mr. Caudle's client was prepared, in a spirit of the greatest accommodation, to discuss. He had documents. He hinted at documents. He laid nothing on the table but the smiling promise of them, which is the oldest trick in his trade. And the Duke, who had sat through a good many men's smiling promises in his time, had let him talk himself out. And then, his small eyes going round the room, Mr. Caudle had come, gently, smilingly, confidentially, to the other matter. The matter, he said, that touched his Grace's good name even nearer than the settlement. It had reached his client's ears. These things did reach one. That there was lately some talk in the house, some question being raised, some person being looked into as to a claim of kindred to the late Mr. Raysham. He hesitated delicately over the word and produced it at last with every appearance of pain at his own frankness. A base-born person. A woman kept long in the house. He would not, he said, for the world, say anything against any person, but his Grace was new come to a great inheritance, and could not be too careful of his title, which was clean, and it was, he must say, a known thing, a sadly known thing, for persons to be placed in great houses against just such a death as this, planted, as one might say, with just such a quarrel and just such a story. To put forward at the right moment a claim of blood and bleed an honourable family of a settlement to be rid of the scandal of a lawsuit, and his client, who wished his Grace nothing but well, had thought it only kind to give his Grace warning, before his Grace let himself be drawn, by any soft tale or any clever forgery, into countenancing a fraud that could only end in shame. It was, Penhallow said, the most perfect piece of work he had heard in 30 years at the bar, because every single thing in it could be turned both ways at once. If the Duke pursued Honora's claim, he was the dupe of a planted fraud and a public fool. If he dropped it, he had as good as confessed she was won, and abandoned her, and the settlement, the unnamed client's phantom prior claim, hung over the whole estate's clean title like a cocked pistol, to be fired or not as suited Mr. Caudle's purposes. The man had come to make it impossible to do right without cost, which is the whole art of his kind, and he had named, smiling, the coral that only the household knew of, that Honora had kept sewn in secret for 30 years. Which meant his unnamed client had a source inside the matter, or near it, and knew far more than a stranger should, and he had risen and bowed and said he would do himself the honour of waiting upon his Grace again in a few days, when his Grace had had leisure to consider, and had smiled his confidential smile all the way out to his hired chaise. They told her that evening, the Duke and Penhallow together, in the South Library, because the Duke would not have a thing done about her behind her back, which was itself so strange a courtesy that she scarcely knew how to receive it. She stood and heard it out, the whole of Caudle's clever cruelty, the planted fraud, the quarrel named, the settlement held over the house, and she found, to her surprise, that her first feeling was not fear for herself, who had so little self left to fear for, but a cold, clear anger she had not felt in years on behalf of the dead old man who had wronged her every day of his life and yet was not. She somehow knew in her bones the kind of man who plants a fraud. He had been too proud, too closed, too genuinely ashamed, whatever the quarrel meant. It was not a confidence trick, and she said so, quietly, the first opinion she had volunteered to anyone in that house in longer than she could remember. He did not plant me, Your Grace. Whatever I am not that. He could not so much as look at me, all his life. A man who plants a fraud can look at it. He could never look at me. The Duke regarded her across the grey room. No, he said slowly, I think you are right. Which means, Miss Raysham, that the quarrel is true, and the placing is true, and there is a real thing under all of this that someone with a great deal to lose would very much rather we did not find, and would slander you, and cloud my title, and threaten us both with a phantom settlement, sooner than let us find it. Caudle is a hired hand. The hand that hired him is afraid. And men are only afraid, he said, very low, of the truth. He looked at her a moment longer, and then he said the thing that frightened her more than Caudle had, more than the dreadful question in the hall, more than anything that had yet been said in that cold house. I am not going to drop it. I want you to understand that plainly, before you spend another sleepless night arranging to protect me by vanishing. They have made it cost something to find out who you are. Very well. It will cost something. I have paid more than this for less, in worse country, against worse men, and I find I would a great deal rather pay it for you." And he turned back to his papers as if he had said nothing at all extraordinary, and left her standing in the grey light, with the whole defended structure of 13 years shifting and groaning around her like river ice in a thaw, because a man had just said, plainly in a level voice, that she was worth a cost, and she did not have, anywhere in her filed-down, careful self, the smallest idea what to do with being worth a cost, except to go down to the still room and stand in the dark among the drying herbs with her hand pressed hard over the place where the coral lay wrapped in its scrap of linen against her heart, and breathe, and not weep, and not hope, and fail, that night, for the first time in 13 years, at both. The days that followed taught Honora a new and difficult arithmetic, which was the arithmetic of being attended to. She had spent 13 years making herself the kind of presence that a room forgets the moment she leaves it. The grey figure at the edge, the hand that set the candle down and withdrew, the voice that answered only when asked, and never volunteered the smallest weather of its own. And she had grown so practised at it that she had come to believe it was not a discipline at all, but simply the truth of her, the actual shape of what she was, a woman built to wait on the far side of every line that mattered. And now there was a man in the house who would not let the room forget her. He did it so quietly that she could not, for some while, have proved to anyone that he was doing it. He did not pay her compliments. He had not, she thought, paid a compliment in his life, and would have distrusted his own mouth if it had tried. He did not seek her out in any way that a watching servant could have named. He simply, steadily, in 100 small, unspectacular ways, declined to overlook her. And she found that being declined to be overlooked by a man who overlooked nothing was a far harder thing to stand under than any unkindness she had ever borne. It began with the reading. The South Library, where the late master had kept the books he never opened, and the Duke now sat through the long blue evenings with his bad leg propped, and a branch of candles at his elbow, had become, by a drift of habit that no one had decided on, the room where the account work was brought to be looked over, and because the account work was Honora's, and because the Duke read everything to the end, she was sent for, those evenings, to stand at the corner of the great table and answer his questions out of the books. The first evening she stood the whole hour, as a servant stands, her hands folded, her eyes down, reciting figures. The second evening, without looking up from the page, he said, "Sit down, Miss Ray-Shemi. I cannot attend to a column of figures and to the discourtesy of keeping you on your feet at the same time, and the figures must come first." It was not gallantry. It was, if anything, framed almost as an irritation, a thing done for his own convenience, and that was precisely why she could bear to do it. Because it asked nothing of her, made no claim, set up no debt. It only, quietly, moved her from the standing place of a servant to the sitting place of a person, and left her there, and went on with the figures. She sat, after that she sat each evening, at the far corner, with the firelight on the ledgers, and the Duke read, and asked, and she answered, and somewhere in the second week the reading stopped being only ledgers. He had picked up, one night, the stolen Book of Waters, the small worn duodecimo on the virtues of the chalybeate and sulphur springs that she had carried out of the still room and forgotten on the table, and turned it in his scarred hand, and read the title, and said, "Yours?" And she had said, before she could file the truth down into something safer, "I have read it a great many times. Your Grace. It is the only book I ever wanted to own and could not buy, and so I kept it. She had meant to say borrowed. She had said kept, which was nearer the shameful truth, and had braced for the small, cold notice such an admission earned in that house. He had only looked at her for a moment, and turned to the first page, and begun, in his level, unbeautiful voice, to read it aloud. The dull catalogue of springs and their dissolved salts and their reputed virtues, the most unromantic text two people ever sat over. And she had understood, sitting in the firelight with her hands gone still in her lap, that he was not reading it to her because it was beautiful, but because it was hers, that he had found the one book in the world she had confessed to wanting, and was giving it back to her the only way a man like him knew how to give anything, which was to take it seriously, to read it to the end, to treat the thing she loved as a thing worth an hour of a duke's evening. No one had ever taken anything of hers seriously in her life. She had not known it was a thing that could happen. She sat very still so that he would not see what it did to her, and he read on, and did not look up, which she came to understand much later was its own kind of courtesy. He had known, of course he had known, and had kept his eyes on the page so that she might have the firelight to herself, and not be watched while the ice cracked. The still room came next, and it came chaperoned, because the Duke did nothing that could be made to look like anything, both for her sake and against Caudle, who he knew was watching the house for exactly such a misstep. It came about because the housekeeper, Mrs. Brooke, let fall that the master's bad leg pained him worst in the wet, and that there had been, in the old still-room book, a receipt of Miss Honora's for an embrocation that the late gardener had sworn by, and the Duke, who would try anything for the leg that did not require him to admit the leg troubled him, had asked through Mrs. Brooke, with Mrs. Brooke standing the whole time in the doorway with her keys, whether Miss Rasham would make it up. So Honora stood at her own scrubbed deal table in the cold, flagged still room, among the hanging bunches and the labelled jars that were the one kingdom in that house that had ever been entirely hers, and ground the resins and warmed the oils and folded in the spirit, and the Duke sat in the still room, a duke, on the hard stool by the window with his stick across his knees, watching her hands work with the close, unhurried attention of a man who had spent years learning to value competence because his life had often depended on it, and asked her questions. Not idle questions, real ones. What the camphor did, and why the beeswax and not the lard, and where she had learned it, and whether the proportions were her own or the book's. And she answered. And somewhere in the answering she forgot, for whole minutes together, to be afraid, because no one had ever asked her to explain the one thing she knew better than anyone in the county, and the explaining was so deep and old a pleasure that it carried her past her guard before she felt the line approaching. She caught herself once, mid-sentence, having actually begun to smile over a remembered failure with a batch of rosewater gone cloudy, and she stopped, and the old grey shutter came down, and she said, "Lo, forgive me, your grace. I run on." And the Duke said, quietly, not moving, "You do not run on. You are interesting, which is a different thing, and a rarer one, and you may go on doing it as long as you like. I have nowhere I would rather be than out of the wind with a competent woman explaining her work, and I have been a great many places I would rather not have been." And Mrs. Brooke in the doorway looked very hard at her keys, and Honora bent her head over the embrocation and did not trust her voice, and gave him at last the little cloth-tied jar, and their hands did not touch, because he was careful, always careful, never to make her flinch, and that carefulness, the deliberate quarter-inch of distance he always kept, told her more about what he was holding back than any nearer thing could have. She measured the whole strange courtship, in those weeks, in fractions of an inch, because fractions of an inch were the only currency she had left herself to spend. When the master of a house bows to the keeper of his accounts, the keeper inclines her head. That is the whole of it. That is the floor and the ceiling of what is permitted between them. And so the Duke, who could have done anything, who held her bread and her roof and her name and her vanishing all in his scarred hand, bowed to her, a real bow, a half-inch of his stiff back. The bow a man gives an equal he respects, and waited, and Honora, terrified, returned it and returned, against 13 years of training, not the flat, dipped head of a servant, but a bow of her own. A quarter-inch, the smallest answer a woman can make that is nevertheless unmistakably an answer. And the Duke saw the quarter-inch, and gave no sign that he had seen it. And the next evening bowed again. And so, by half-inches offered and quarter-inches returned, across the corner of a ledger-strewn table in the failing blue light, two people who had each in their separate ways decided long ago to want nothing began, without one word being spoken that Caudle or the law or the watching servants could ever have laid a finger on, to court. And all the while the other thing went forward, the thing that was the reason she was sent for and the reason Caudle smiled, the slow, grinding search for who she was. And it was Honora herself, in the end doing what she did better than anyone alive, who found the door. For the Duke had given the order, against Penhallow's caution and her own pleading, that the muniments be searched, the great iron-bound chests in the cold room over the buttery where 4 generations of Rashombe deeds and settlements and letter-books and estate correspondence lay in their dust. And there was no one in the house, no one in the county, who knew those papers as Honora knew them. Because she had filed half of them herself across 13 years and copied the other half, and carried the whole disordered memory of them in the same trained mind that held every farthing of the accounts. Penhallow's clerk could have spent a year in that room and found nothing. Honora went up into the cold with a single candle because she could not be kept out of the only work that had ever made her feel real, and because some part of her that she did not examine too closely needed to be the one who found it, whatever it was. Needed, if her own undoing was written somewhere in those chests, to be the hand that lifted it into the light. And not a stranger's. She worked the way she did everything, with a still and pitiless thoroughness, the candle guttering, her breath smoking in the unheated room, the dust greying her dark gown, and on the third evening, deep in the oldest chest, behind the bundled leases of farms that had not existed under that name for 40 years, she found the letter-book. It was old Silas's own, his private letter-book, not the estate's, the bound blank book in which a careful man of business kept his own pressed copies of the letters he wrote, so that he should always have a record of what he had said. The estate's letter-books she knew, this one she had never seen, and understood at once why, for it had been hidden deliberately. Weighted to the bottom of the chest under the dead leases, where no honest search for deeds would ever have cause to lift it, and her hands, opening it, were not quite steady, because a man who hides his own letter-book has written, somewhere in it, a thing he could not bear to have found, and could not bring himself to burn. The early leaves were ordinary, the dry traffic of a landed gentleman's private affairs, agents and physicians and a wine merchant in Bristol, and she nearly, in her trained patience, read them all in order before she came to the thing. But the candle was low, and something, some old still-room instinct for the place where the trouble lives, made her turn instead to the leaves that had been pressed and never afterwards disturbed, the ones whose edges had stuck faintly together with age and want of handling, near the front, dated in the spring of 1789. And there, in the cramped private hand she had copied 10,000 figures in, she found the letters her own dead father had written, and they were not Silas's letters at all. She did not understand it the first reading. She sat down on the lid of the chest because her legs would not be relied upon, and held the candle close, and read it again. The letters had been laid into Silas's book, pressed flat, and kept, not as copies of what he had written, but as the originals of what had been written to him. By another man, a man who signed himself with a name she had never in her life heard spoken in that house, a Mr. Edmund Harlow. And the letters were terrible, and they were tender, and they were the letters of a man dying a long way off and out of money, writing to the brother-in-law who held his disgrace in his hands, about a child, about a daughter he could not keep and could not own and could not, in the end, do anything for except beg. The letters went down, leaf by leaf, from a gentleman's stiff request to a dying man's naked begging. Beg that she be taken in, that she be kept. That she be kept, the last letter said, in the hand gone loose and dreadful with fever, near you, and fed, and taught, and let live, though I know you will never let her be named, and I do not ask it. I ask only that she live, and when she is grown, if ever a kindness can be done her without the ruin of your house, that it be done. And I send with her the only thing of her mother's I have left to send, the coral, that she may have one thing in the world that is hers by right and not by charity. And I am, sir, dying as I have lived, your most wretched and obliged servant, E. Harlow. The coral, her coral, the silver and coral rattle wrapped in linen against her heart at that very moment, the one object in the world that no parish had ever given her, that she had kept 30 years not knowing what it was, only that it was the single thing she owned that proved someone once, with money and a reason, had wanted her to have a thing that was hers by right. It was her mother's, a gentlewoman's, sent with her by her father, who was not Silas Rayshom at all, who was a Mr. Edmund Harlow, a gentleman fallen and dying, who had written, in the last letters of his life, begging another man to let his daughter merely live. Honora sat on the cold lid of the iron chest in the guttering dark, with the letters of her dead father in her hands, and the first thing she felt, before the grief, before the vertigo, before the slow, tremendous turning over of 13 years of careful nothing, the very first thing she felt was a kind of wild, broken, soundless gratitude that whatever else was true, whatever else these papers held, this much was now certain and could never be taken from her again. She had not been planted. She was no fraud's coral, no schemer's contrivance, no base thing smuggled into a great house to bleed it. She was a man's daughter, and he had loved her enough to die begging for her, and he had sent her the coral so that she should have, in all the long cold charity of her life, one single thing that was hers by right, and she had kept it, not knowing, all these years, against her heart. She pressed the letters to her face in the dark and made no sound, because 13 years of making no sound do not come undone in a night, and the candle burned down to the socket, and somewhere below her in the warm part of the house the Duke sat over his figures with a chair empty at the corner of the table where she should have been, and did not yet know what she had found. But the letter-book held one thing more, and she found it because she was who she was, and finished what she began, and read to the end even with her father's letters wet in her lap, for the spring of 1789 was not the last entry the hidden book held. Behind the letters, on the final pressed leaf, in old Silas's own cramped hand, and not Harlow's, sealed across the fold with a wafer of his own ring that no one had broken in 30 years, was a folded memorandum, and on its outer face, in the dead man's writing, were 4 words that stopped her breath in her throat and held her for a long moment, suspended over the whole rest of her life, to be opened after. After what? The man had not written, because a man who hides such a thing knows what after he means. But she knew, holding it, with the cold certainty of the still room, that the after had come, that Silas Raychalme was 11 weeks in his grave, and the after he had meant was his own death, and the thing he had sealed against that day with his own ring, and buried under the dead leases where only a daughter's patient hand would ever find it, was the thing he had been too proud and too ashamed and too afraid to say in all the 13 years he could not look at her. She did not break the seal. Her hand shook over it, and she did not break it, because some last, filed-down instinct of the servant she had trained herself to be told her, even now, even here, with her father's love in her lap and the sealed memorandum in her hand, that a thing of this weight must not be opened alone, by candle end, in a cold room, by a woman who could still be called, by a smiling man in a hired chaise. A fraud. It must be opened in the light. It must be opened before witnesses. It must be opened, she understood, by the one man in that house who read everything to the end and would let nothing lie, and had said, in a level voice, that she was worth the cost. And so she gathered the letters, and the sealed memorandum, and the candle stub, and went down out of the cold with the proof of herself held against the coral over her heart, to find the Duke of Carrow. She found him where she knew she would, in the South Library, the branch of candles burned low, the bad leg propped, a column of figures abandoned under his hand, because the woman who was to explain it had not come down, and he looked up as she stood in the doorway with the dust of the muniment room greying her gown, and her face the colour of the ash on the hearth, and the letter-book held against her like a wound, and he did not say a word about the lateness, or the dust, or the figures. He set down his pen. He looked at her for one long moment with the close, still attention of a man who has stood in many doorways and learned to read in a single glance what a person is carrying. And then he rose, with the difficulty the leg cost him, which he never let anyone see, and let her see now, and crossed the room, and drew out the chair at the corner of the table where she sat each evening, and stood behind it, waiting until she came and sat, because he would not seat himself while she stood with that look on her face. "Tell me," he said. "Not what is it, not what have you found. Tell me, the order a man gives who means to take the whole weight of a thing onto himself and has no intention of letting it fall back on her. And Honora, who had carried everything alone for 13 years and had not known, until that exact moment, how heavy alone had been, laid the letter-book open on the table between them, in the candlelight, and turned it to the leaves of the spring of 1789, and put her finger on her dead father's hand, and found that her voice, when at last she used it, was steady. His name was Harlow, she said. Edmund Harlow. He was dying. He wrote these. He was my father, your grace, and the coral was my mother's, and I was not planted. I was sent. He sent me here so that I should live." And the Duke read. He read every leaf, in order, from the stiff first request to the naked last begging, the way he read everything, to the end, his scarred face giving nothing, and his jaw at the last leaf going very tight. And when he had finished, he was silent a long while, and then he said, "Lo," not looking up, "he died asking another man to be kind to you on a condition. If a kindness can be done without ruin to the house." 13 years that man weighed the kindness against the ruin, and chose the ruin of you. Every day. By the column of a wage book. And there was something in his level voice when he said it, a cold banked thing, that was not for her at all, but for the dead, and that told her, better than any tenderness could have, that he had understood the whole of it, not the romance of it, not the discovery of it, but the long, grinding daily arithmetic of a child kept alive and unnamed by a man who counted every single day for 13 years and found her not worth the cost. He had said, a fortnight since, that he would rather pay a cost for her than not. She understood now what he had been answering before either of them had known the question. "There is more," she said, when she could. "He sealed it himself, after Harlow, in his own hand." And she laid the folded memorandum on the open book, the 4 words upward in the candlelight, to be opened after, and she said, "I would not open it alone, Your Grace. I did not. I could not be the only one to," and stopped, because she did not have the words for it. For the thing that was, that a woman who has been called a fraud cannot be the sole witness to her own vindication, but he had the words, or rather he had the act, which in him was always truer than words. "No," he agreed, quietly, "you were right. Nothing more is to be opened in this house with one pair of eyes on it. Not now." And he did not break the seal. He rang. Instead, the bell pulled by the cold hearth at near midnight, and when the sleepy footman came he sent for Penhallow, who was lodged in the house against just such turns, and for Mrs. Brooke, who had known the spring of 1789, who had been white-lipped in the hall the day the ledger was read aloud, and he had them brought into the candlelight of the South Library and stood about the table. The lawyer in his nightgown and his caution, the housekeeper with her shawl caught up and her keys, so that whatever the dead man had sealed should be opened, when it was opened, before the law and before the one living person who remembered, and never afterwards be deniable by any smiling man on earth. Miss Raysham found this an hour since, the Duke told them. In the level voice he used for the things that mattered most, in my late uncle's private letter book, hidden under dead leases in the oldest muniment chest, with letters laid in it from a Mr. Edmund Harlow, deceased, concerning the placing of a child in this house in the spring of 1789. The letters I have read, you shall read them. This was sealed, with them, in my uncle's own hand and ring, against his death. It has not been opened. I will open it now before you all, that there be no question hereafter of how it came to light, or in whose hand, or whether any person living had the doing of it. And Penhallow, all lawyer now and no nightgown, said, Your Grace, before you break it, the seal entire, the ring its own, the leaves undisturbed. Mrs. Brooke, you knew the household that spring. Will you witness that this hand, he turned the memorandum to the candle, is the late Mr. Raysham's, and no others? And Mrs. Brooke, leaning close, her old face working, said, That is the master's hand, sir. I would know it among 1,000. I have took his orders in it 30 years, and so it was witnessed before it was opened. And the Duke turned the folded paper once in his scarred fingers, and looked across the candle flame at Honora, one look that asked her plainly, Are you ready? And gave her plainly the room to say no, and Honora, who had waited 13 years on the far side of every line that mattered, put her hand flat on the table to steady it, and met his eyes, and did not look away, and said, Open it, Your Grace. And he broke the dead man's seal. The paper came open under his hands with the small dry crack of wax long set, and the leaf within unfolded stiff, and he turned it square to the branch of candles, and he read it the way he read everything, aloud and to the end, in the level voice that took nothing for itself, and gave the words no colour they did not own, so that the dead man's own meaning neither softened nor sharpened, stood up bare in the cold room for all 4 of them to hear, aye, Silas Rayshome of Rayshome Hall in the County Palatine, being of sound mind though failing body, do set down here, against the day this is read, the truth of the child known in my house as Honora, that I have not had the courage to set down in any place where it might be found in my lifetime, and have not had the cruelty, quite, to carry whole into the ground. He paused there, one breath, and went on. She is no foundling, nor base-born of any servant, nor any charge of the parish, whatever the register of her christening was made to say at my procuring and to my lasting shame. She is the lawful and only child of my late and lawful younger sister, Frances Rayshome, married in secret and against my will in the year 88 to Mr. Edmund Harlow, gentleman, of small fortune and failing health, whom I in my pride forbade the house and would not own, which marriage was good and regular and entered, as I have since assured myself, in the register of the parish of St. Bride at Hartsmere, where any man may find it who is told where to look. The 11th day of June, 88. Mrs. Brooke made a sound, low in her throat, and pressed her knuckles to her mouth, and did not take her eyes from the page. My sister died of the childbed in the spring of 89. The Duke read on, and her husband, dying himself, and knowing what I was, sent the infant to me with her mother's coral, asking only that I keep her alive and let her live under my roof, and naming her in his last letter Honora, which was our own mother's name, that I might find it the harder to turn the child from the door. I did not turn her from the door. I have told myself these 13 years that this was kindness. It was not kindness. I kept her as one keeps a thing one cannot in conscience destroy, and will not in pride acknowledge. I let it be put about that she was got of a servant and taken in for charity, because the truth of her was the truth of my sister's marriage, which I had forbidden, and of my own cruelty to a dying woman, which I could not bear to have looked at, and because, while she stood unnamed. The whole of this estate came to me clean, and went from me clean to whom I chose, and a named niece, lawful daughter of a lawful Rayshome, was an heir at law with a claim upon it that I did not choose to allow. The Duke's voice did not change at that, but his thumb pressed white against the edge of the leaf. So I wrote her, with my own hand, year upon year, into the wage book of my own household, among the still-room maids and the dairy, no wage set down, board only, that there might be no paper anywhere in the house that called her by what she was, and I made of my own sister's child a servant in her own father's house, and I knew what I did, and I did it every Lady Day for 13 years, and I am setting it down now, because I find that I cannot. After all, carry it whole into the ground, and I have not the courage to undo it while I live and be looked at for it. Whoever reads this, she is Honora Harlow, gentlewoman, my sister's lawful child, wronged by me alone and by no fault of her own being or birth, and what reparation the law and your own conscience can make her, I ask, too late, that you make. Silas Rayshome, sealed this 3rd day of November in the year 1818. And under it, the Duke said, in the same flat voice, his name again and his ring, pressed twice. He laid the leaf down on the open letter-book, exactly square the way she would have laid it, and for a moment no one in the room spoke at all. The candles ticked, and the bad wind worked at the south window, and Honora sat with her 2 hands flat on the cold table and found that she was not weeping, that the thing in her was too large and too old and too strange to come out as weeping, that it sat in her chest like a stone taken up after long carrying, heavier in the lifting than it had been in the bearing. Frances, her mother had a name, and it was Frances, And she had been a gentlewoman, and she had married for love against a hard brother, and died of it. And the brother had spent 13 years and a wage book hiding what he had done to the both of them. And Honora Harlow. She said the name once, inside herself, the way one says a word in a language one was born to and never taught, and it fit. Terribly. It fit like a key turned in a lock she had stopped believing had a door behind it. It was Penhallow who broke the silence, and he broke it gently, and as a lawyer, which was the kindest thing he could have done, because it gave the room something to do that was not feeling. Your Grace, he said, I must say plainly what this is, that no one here mistake it for less or for more. This is a holograph declaration, entire in the late owner's hand, witnessed now as to that hand by a servant of 30 years' standing, attesting a lawful marriage and a lawful birth, and naming the place of record of both. It is not of itself the marriage, it is not of itself the birth, but it tells us precisely where to find them, St. Bride at Hartsmere, the 11th of June, 88, for the one, and the christening that was falsely entered for the other, which falseness this paper now explains and arms us to correct. If those registers say what this paper says they say, and a dead man does not lie himself into his own shame for sport, then Miss Harlow stands before us tonight, the lawful issue of a lawful ratio marriage, and the late settlement of this estate, made on the false footing that the blood died with the master, stands open to question at her suit. He folded his hands. I would not have her hope built on this paper alone. I would have her hope built on this paper and the 2 registers it points to, fetched and proved. But I will say, as a man who has spent 40 years distrusting documents, that I have rarely held one I distrusted less. He had nothing to gain by it, and his soul to lose. Then it will be fetched, the Duke said. Tomorrow, Penhallow, you will go yourself to Hartsmere, and to the christening parish, with a clerk and with the means to take examined copies under the incumbent's hand and seal, and you will let no original out of your sight and bring the copies back to me. And Mrs. Brooke, he turned to the housekeeper, who stood with her shawl gripped at her throat and the tears standing in her old eyes and not falling. You will set down, fair, all that you remember of the spring of 89, the day the child came, and in whose arms, and what was said, and the choral, and who told you what you were to say of her after, everything, while it is fresh from the hearing of this. Not because I doubt you, because a thing remembered before witnesses on the night it was raised is worth, in a hard room, 10 things remembered a year on. Mrs. Brooke nodded, and the first tear went down, and she let it. I should have spoke years since, she said. Lo, I knew it for a wrong. The wage book, I knew it the first Lady Day I writ her in at his order, no wage, board only. And I writ it because he was the master, and I had my place and my own to keep, and God forgive me, I writ her in among my own maids 12 year more. I should have spoke. You speak now, the Duke said, not ungently, before it is too late to mend, which is more than the man who did it managed, who spoke only to a sealed paper and only of his death. Do not take his sin onto your own back. You held your place. He held the whip. And Mrs. Brooke, who had been the nearest thing to a hard mother Honora had ever known, looked across the candle at the grey woman she had ordered about a still room for a dozen years, and said, simple and broken, You were always too good for the place I kept you in, child. I told myself it was not my doing. It was a little my doing. I am main sorry for it. And Honora, who had taught her grief to wait on the far side of a line, and her gratitude with it, and her anger, all of it, all the wanting, banished beyond a ruled margin where it could not trouble the columns, felt the line itself go, quietly, like a thread worn through, and reached across the corner of the table and took the old woman's hard hand in both of hers and could not for a moment say anything at all. It was very late when Penhallow and Mrs. Brooke went out, the lawyer to sleep an hour and order his chaise, the housekeeper to her cold sheet of paper and her 30 years of remembering, and Honora was left in the South Library with the Duke and the burned-down candles, and the proof of herself lying open on the table between them. And she did not know, now that the witnesses were gone, how to be in the room. For 13 years she had known exactly how to be in any room. She was the keeper of the accounts. She stood by the door, she carried the tray, she filed her own self away beyond the margin and let the columns speak. She had no posture for this. She did not know whether she was, in this room, tonight, the keeper of his accounts, or his cousin in blood, or a gentlewoman wronged, or a fraud not yet disproved, or a woman a careful wounded man had said, in a level voice, he would rather pay a cost for than not. She stood, because standing was safest, and began, from old habit, to square the loose leaves of the letter-book and gather the candle stub, to put the room in order and take herself out of it, and the Duke watched her do it for a moment. And then he said, quietly, "Leave it. Sit a moment. The room can be in order in the morning. You have been 13 years putting rooms in order so that you need not be in them. Sit." And she sat, because the thing he had named was so exactly the thing she did that hearing it said aloud took the strength out of her knees. "I will not say much tonight," he said, "because tonight you have had said to you the one enormous thing, and a man who piles more onto an enormous thing is a fool. And I have been called many things, but not, I hope, that. But I will say two, and then I will see you to the foot of the stairs, and we will both try to sleep, and tomorrow Penhallow will fetch the cold proof of what we already know." He turned a little in his chair, the bad leg shifting, and the candle caught the long, pale scar at his jaw that he never troubled to hide, and never displayed. "The first is this. Whatever the registers say, and they will say what the dead man's shame says they say, I have no doubt of it, nothing of who you are tonight is made by them, or unmade by them. You did not become my cousin's lawful daughter when a paper came open in this room an hour since. You were her, the whole of these 13 years, in the still room and at the wage book and standing by the door. The wrong was a wrong, every single one of those days, whether or not any paper ever came to light to call it one. The paper does not make you. The paper only makes it sayable, in a hard room by a hard lawyer to hard men who count. Do not let anyone, tomorrow or ever, tell you that you became someone tonight. You were always someone. They are only now compelled to write it down." Honora sat very still. No one in 13 years had ever told her she had been someone all along. She had been so careful never to require it told her that she had half forgotten it was a thing that could be true. And the second, the Duke said, and here, for the first time, something moved under the level voice, a hesitation that was not weakness, but its opposite, the particular care of a man who has decided to spend a thing he does not spend lightly. "The second I will only begin tonight, and finish another day, in a fairer light, when you are not grey with muniment dust and reeling from the dead. But I will begin it, because I find I do not want you to lie awake tonight in any doubt of it, and because you have spent 13 years being given less than the truth, and I will not, even out of delicacy, give you less than the truth one night more." He looked at her, full, the close-still attention that read everything. "When Caudle came here with his smile and his hired chaise, and his hint that you were a fraud got up to bleed my house, My own counsel advised me to let you go quietly south, with a character and a small sum, and so be clear of the question and of you. It was prudent advice. I did not take it, and I told myself and them that I did not take it because I do not let a thing lie unread, and I will not be made to do a wrong for my own convenience. That was true. It was not the whole of it. He paused. The whole of it is that some weeks before Caudle ever darkened the door, I had already stopped being able to think of this house with you gone south out of it as a house I should want to live in. I am not a man who says such things easily or ever before tonight, and I say it badly, and I say it before the proof is even fetched, which a prudent man would not. But I have been prudent my whole life, and I was prudent through a war, and prudence cost me a great deal, and got me, in the end, a quiet house, and a column of figures, and a bad leg, and I find I am done being only prudent. I am telling you tonight, before the registers, before any of it is safe or settled or sayable in a drawing-room, so that you will know it was never the inheritance, and never the proof, and never the doing of the right thing, that I came to it before there was any inheritance to be had, or any proof to fetch, when you were still only, to all the world and to your own self, the grey keeper of my accounts who stood by the door. I will say the rest of it properly when the dust is off you and the registers are home, but I would not have you sleep tonight thinking the man only meant to be just. The man meant a good deal more than just, and has for some while, and is too old a soldier to be ashamed of saying so. There, that is the second thing. I have begun it badly, and I will finish it better. Now I will see you to the stairs. And he rose, with the cost the leg exacted, and let her see it again, which she understood now to be itself a kind of speech, the deliberate showing of a guarded thing, and he gave her his arm, not took hers, gave her his, the difference an ocean, and walked her, slow for the leg and slower for the strangeness, the length of the dark corridor to the foot of the great stair, where a single candle burned in its bracket, and at the foot of the stair he stopped, and she stopped, and he did not attempt her hand, nor anything, only inclined his head to her, a half-inch of a bow, the exact half-inch he had given her the first evening across the still room when she was the keeper of accounts and nothing more, and Honora, who had returned that first half-inch with a careful quarter, stood now at the foot of her father's stair, in her father's house, the lawful daughter of a Francis she had never been let know she had, and gave the Duke of Carrow deliberately, slowly, the full half-inch back, even, matched, the bow of one gentlewoman to a gentleman who has spoken to her as an equal, and she saw him see it, and saw the corner of the scarred mouth move, not a smile, the country of a smile, the border of one, and she went up the stairs with the candle and did not look back, because if she looked back, she would not be able to climb them, and lay awake the whole short remainder of the night with her mother's name going round and round in her like a tune learned in a cradle she could not remember. Francis, Francis Rashombe, Francis Harlow, and the coral cold and then warm against her heart where she held it, and slept, at the very last, an hour before the grey dawn, more deeply than she had slept in 13 years. Penhallow's chaise went out before she woke, into a hard, bright February morning, with the frost standing white on the south lawns, and was gone 3 days. And they were 3 strange days for Honora, days with no shape she knew, because the keeping of the accounts had been taken gently out of her hands. You will not sit at that wage-book again, the Duke had said. The first morning, in a voice that closed the matter, the book is evidence now, and a wrong besides, and you are not the keeper of it, Mrs. Brooke's niece can total the dairy, and she did not yet know what she was instead, and so the days yawned. She walked in the cold gardens she had walked for 13 years and looked at them differently, not as a servant looks at the grounds she may cross on an errand, but as a daughter looks at the land her mother was a girl in, she found. In the long gallery she had dusted 100 times. The small dark portrait of a young woman she had passed 10,000 times and never been told to look at, labelled only F.W. 1786, and she stood before it the better part of an hour, looking at the line of the jaw and the set of the grey eyes that were, she saw now, with a lurch, her own grey eyes, and understood that she had walked past her own mother's face every day for 13 years and been let think it a stranger's. And she sat, in the evenings, with the Duke, in the South Library. And they did not speak again of the second thing, by a kind of mutual mercy, until the registers should be home, but they read, the two of them, as they had taken to reading, a chapter turnabout, his deep level voice, and her low even one going back and forth across the small table in the candlelight, and the not speaking of it, with the thing said and standing between them unfinished, was its own slow sweetness, like the held pause before a named and certain music. But the days were not all gardens and reading, because the world does not stop to let a wrong be mended, and on the second of the 3 days, while Penhallow's chaise was still somewhere on the Hertsmere road, Mr. Caudle came back. He came back smiling in his hired chaise with a second man this time, a Mr. Sleek, an attorney of the harder London sort, all soft hands and hard eyes, and he came back, this time not hinting but declaring, because he had learned by some servant's loose tongue or some watcher in the village that a paper had come to light in the muniment room and a lawyer had gone posting north, and he had understood, being no fool whatever else he was, that his window was closing, and that a man whose fraud is about to be disproved must strike hardest in thee. Last hour before the proof comes home, he demanded to see the Duke, he was shown, by a footman who did not like him, into the great hall and made to wait, which he did not like, and when the Duke came down to him, slow on the bad leg, with Honora at his quiet insistence, standing not by the door where she would have put herself, but at his side where he had placed her, Caudle made his last throw, and made it ugly, because ugly was all he had left. "Your Grace," he said, oily and quick, "I come as a friend to your house, which is more than your house deserves of me. I am told a paper has been found, conveniently found, in a locked muniment room, by this very woman, alone, by candlelight, the night before your own lawyer rides north to swear to it. I am told it is in your late uncle's hand. Your Grace, I have practised 40 years, and I have seen many papers found by interested persons in locked rooms, and I will tell you what a court will tell you. A holograph that surfaces in the hands of the one person on earth it enriches, found alone, unwitnessed in the finding, is the commonest forgery in England, and the easiest. This woman has kept your uncle's books and letter books for 13 years. She knows his hand as she knows her own. Better, she has copied it 10,000 times into ledgers and onto labels, and across the heads of accounts. Who in this house could counterfeit Silas Rayshom's hand, if not the very clerk who wrote at his elbow a dozen years? I do not say she did. I say a court will ask it, loudly, and your clean title and your good name will be dragged through a year of it, and at the end the world will say, the Duke of Carrow was gulled by a clever servant into making his housekeeper his heir, or, and here the smile sharpened to its point, into something a deal worse than his heir, your Grace, for the talk of the county is already running, and it does not run kindly, on why a wounded duke keeps a grey serving woman at his elbow of an evening and will not let her go south. And Sleek, beside him, said nothing, only let his hard eyes rest on Honora with a weighing insolence, as one prices a thing he means to break. For a heartbeat, the great hall was perfectly still, and Honora felt the old reflex come up in her like cold water. The 13-year habit of taking herself out of a room before her presence could cost anyone anything. And she half turned, already framing in her mind the small grey sentence, "Your Grace, I will withdraw. I would not be the occasion of talk against the house." That would let her vanish, and let the question vanish with her. And the Duke, without looking at her, without a glance, as though he had felt the turn begin through the very air between them, said one word, low, not to Caudle, to her, "Stay." And she stayed, and then, and only then, he turned the full of his attention onto the two men by the cold hearth. And when he spoke, it was not loud. It was never loud. It was the levelness itself that made the footman by the door go pale, the voice of a man who had given quiet orders under fire, and learned that the quietest order is the one no one dares disobey. "Mr. Caudle," he said, "you have come into my house twice now uninvited, and twice you have come to sell me a fear. The first time you sold it as a hint. This time you sell it as a kindness, which is the lowest form of the trade. Let me tell you what you have miscounted, since counting is the only language men of your sort respect. You have counted on my caring more for my clean title and my good name than for the truth of a wrong done in this house. And there you have read your man entirely backward, which is a poor performance in a 40 years lawyer, and I would have a refund of your fee were I your client, which, thank God, I am not. I do not want a clean title bought with a buried sister. I would rather stand in a court for a year and have the whole county say what it likes of why a wounded duke will not send a wronged woman south, than keep 1 shilling or 1 quiet hour that was got by pretending my own cousin's lawful daughter is a fraud because it is cheaper to my comfort that she be one. You have offered me my comfort. I decline it. Mark that I do not decline it in heat. I have no heat to spare you. I decline it in cold blood, having counted, as you bade me count, and found the price of my comfort to be one woman's whole life, and judged it, in the plain commercial sense you will understand, too dear. He let that sit, one breath, and went on, and now the cold thing under the level voice came nearer the surface, banked still, but near. As to your forgery, you are quite right that Miss Harlowe knows her uncle's hand. You are quite right that she found the paper. You would be right, were the paper all, but you have made the error every clever man makes who is cleverer than he is honest. You have assumed the rest of us as careless as you would have been. The paper was not opened by her, alone, by candlelight. She did not break the seal. She carried it down sealed, unopened, to me, declining, Mr. Caudle, of her own act, against her own interest, to be the sole witness to her own vindication, which is not, you may find, the conduct of a forger in the flush of her forgery. It was opened by me, in this house, at midnight, before my solicitor, Mr. Penhallow, who is gone north this minute to fetch the examined registers, and before Mrs. Brooke, my housekeeper of 30 years, who witnessed the hand to be her late master's before ever the seal was broken, and who has set down, in writing signed, what she knew of the child's coming in 89, before any of this came to light. And the paper does not enrich Miss Harlowe by my gift. It points to 2 parish registers written in 88 and 89 by clergymen now strangers to this case, which a dead woman's child cannot have forged 30 years before she could hold a pen. You came to tell me a court would ask hard questions. By all means, let it ask them. I have, you will find, harder answers than you have counted on, because unlike you, I prepared mine before I needed them, and unlike you, I did not have to lie." Caudle's smile had gone somewhere about the middle of this, and he tried for it again now and could not quite recover it, and Sleek, the harder man, made one last cold cast, because it was his trade too. "Fine words, Your Grace," he said soft, "but examined copies are got from incumbents, and incumbents are men, and a man with a sister's whole estate at stake might find a country parson's memory and a country parson's pen surprisingly biddable for a consideration. We shall see what your Mr. Penhallow brings home, and we shall see who paid for it." And the Duke looked at him, a long, flat look, the look he must have given men across a parley ground, and he said, "We shall. And when he brings it home, Mr. Sleek, you will have made in my hall, before my servants, an accusation against a clergyman of the church, and against an officer of my own employ of conspiracy to corrupt a parish register. And if the registers say what I believe they will say, I will hold you to that accusation, by name, in front of every man whose good opinion you have ever traded on, until you are as welcome in the attorneys' coffee-houses of London as a forged note. You came here to threaten my name with a year of talk. Consider, before you go, whose name is the more easily spent, a duke's, that the world is slow to credit ill of, or a hired attorney's, that the world is glad of any excuse to credit ill of at all. Now, you have had my answer. Bray it where you please. The door you came in by will let you out again, and my footman will see that it does, and you will not be shown into this hall a third time on any errand whatever. Good day to you both." And he turned, deliberately, his back to them, the one unmistakable insult of the age, the turned back of a great man to a small one, and offered Honora his arm, in front of them, and walked her out of the hall by the inner door at the slow, even pace the bad leg set, leaving Caudle and Sleek to be bowed out into their hired chaise by a footman who, the household would say, for a year after, did it with a relish that very nearly amounted to a kick. He did not speak until they were in the small south parlour with the door drawn to, and Susan posted, plainly visible, at her needle by the window, for he was a man who would not buy her vindication with a fresh occasion for talk, and even there he did not at once speak, but stood a moment looking out at the bare February park, as though the saying of the next thing cost him more than the rooting of the lawyer had. Then he said, still to the window, "I should not have made you stay through that. To be spoken of so, to your face, as a thing, I have stood men against a wall for less, and I made you stand and hear it. Forgive me. I had no way to spare you that did not also let him win, and I would not let him win, but the price of his not winning was that you bore it, and that was got at your cost, not mine, and I am ashamed of it." And Honora, who had been steadied through the whole of the great hall by the strange iron of his anger, and felt herself only now beginning to shake with the aftermath of it, found that the thing she could not bear was not Caudle's insult, but this, that the man should turn from a victory to apologize to her for the manner of it, and she said, "Lo, your Grace, in 13 years no person living has thought my cost worth the counting. You need not begin by apologizing for the 1 hour you spent it well." And he turned from the window at that, and looked at her, and something moved behind the closed quiet of his face that he did not let come all the way up, and he said only, "We will see what Penhallow brings." What Penhallow brought, 11 days later, on a raw evening with the roads half ice, was a flat japanned box, and a face that told the half of it before he had his coat off. He had ridden to 2 parishes and a cathedral registry, and a silversmith's shop in a Westmoreland market town, and he laid out on the long table in the muniment room, in the order of their making, the documents that turned a found paper into a proven life. There was the marriage line, copied true and examined under the incumbent's own hand, and the bishop's seal, Silas Raysham, bachelor of Raysham in this county, and Mary Ann Hartley, spinster of this parish, married by licence the 4th of October 1788. Witnessed by two whose names meant nothing to Honora and everything to the law. There was the baptism, the year following, in a parish 40 miles distant, where a frightened gentlewoman had been sent to be brought to bed away from talk, Honora, daughter of Mary Ann Hartley, and there, in the column where the father's name should stand, the blank that had cost her 13 years. But beside it now, where Penhallow set the second sheet to it, Silas's own sealed memorandum naming the child, the date, the parish, the reason for the silence, the lawsuit he had feared from his first wife's people over the entail, the shame he had let outweigh his blood. There was the silversmith's ledger, the maker's mark on the coral matched to a line in a daybook, a christening gift of silver and coral, paid for in full by Mr. S. Raysham, the autumn of 1789. And there, last, the thing that undid Honora where all the law had only steadied her. Among the loose papers in the box, 2 of her dead mother's letters, kept these 30 years in Silas's own hand, unanswered, the ink browned, the folds worn soft as cloth, in which a young woman with a fine plain hand wrote to the man who had married and hidden her, not in reproach, but asking only that the child be owned some day. Some day, when his fear was less, and across the second in Silas's writing, dated the very week he died. 3 words and no more, God forgive me. Honora read the 3 words and did not weep. She had taught her grief too long to come on command for it to come now, in a room before men. She set the letter down very exactly square, with the table's edge, the old habit of the keeper of papers, and she said, in a voice she was proud to find level, "Thank you, Mrs. Penhallow. They are in good order." And she went out, and walked the cold length of the still room, and stood among the labelled jars of waters she had distilled in all the years she had no name, and there, alone, with no one to cost anything, she let the thing come. Not the storm she might have feared, but a long, low, shaking grief. Grief for the mother sent away to bear her in a strange parish. Grief for the father who had loved her enough to mark the coral and feared the world enough to leave the column blank. Grief most of all, and most surprisingly, for herself. For the girl who had stood at line-ups for 13 years, arranging her face into nothing. Who had been, the whole of that time, the thing she had told herself she had no right to be, a daughter of the house. Lawful. Named in heaven, if not in the book, wanted once by a frightened young woman in a borrowed bed who had asked only that she be owned some day. Some day had come too late for her mother and too late for her father. It had not, she understood, kneeling there at last among her own waters with her face in her hands, quite come too late for her. The proving of a thing in law is not the speaking of it in the world, and the two are different labours, and the second the Duke could not do, for a man cannot carry his own intended wife's vindication through the drawing-rooms without it being said he gilds his bargain. It was done instead, and done flawlessly, by the Lady Sabine Vaucourt, the Duke's aunt, his mother's sister, a widow of 60 who had buried a diplomat husband and 3 sovereigns' worth of secrets and feared exactly nothing that London could do to her. She came down to Raysham in March, looked at Honora for a long, unhurried minute with the eye of a woman who had spent 40 years telling the true bread from the climbers. Said Hartley, "Yes. I remember a Mary Ann Hartley brought out the year I married, pretty, clever, vanished, they said a decline, I never believed it, and from that hour took the whole matter into her too capable hands. She did not argue Honora's case, arguing concedes there is a case. She did the far deadlier thing, she assumed it. She carried the proven truth through the proper houses in the steady, idle tone of a woman with nothing whatever to conceal and nothing to gain, mentioning, between the tea and the cards, that her nephew Caro had found his late cousin's affairs in shocking disorder, a marriage half buried out of some old nonsense of a lawsuit, a daughter left these 30 years without her name. Too sad. Too like poor Silas, who never could face a thing, but happily all in order now, the registers quite clear, the bishop's people most obliging, and the girl herself, she would add, with the faint surprise of the connoisseur, really remarkably her mother over again, the same fine quiet. You would never take her for anything but what she is. And because Lady Sabine said it, and Lady Sabine had never in 60 years been known to trim a fact to please a relation, it was believed, wholly and at once, in the only way that signifies, believed not as a defence to be weighed, but as a piece of settled news to be passed on, so that the story ran through London in the shape Lady Sabine had cut for it. And by the time it reached the ears that mattered it, was no longer a question whether Miss Hartley of Raysham was Silas's lawful daughter, but merely a wonder that the foolish man had let it lie so long. And into that current caudal and sleek sailed their leaking craft, and it sank under them as such craft do, not in one great wreck, but in 100 small refusals. For a fraud's whole capital is that he is believed enough to be worth buying off, and when Lady Sabine had finished, no one believed Caudle worth a farthing. Penhallow, on the Duke's instruction, and with the cold patience of a man who had been told plainly that he might at last off the leash, laid before the proper society a quiet account of how a certain attorney had come twice into a great house to sell a fear, had hinted a lawful daughter a forger, had stood by while his man accused a clergyman of the church of selling his register, and had done all this, it transpired, while himself holding a contingent fee from a remote and disappointed cousin who stood to take the estate if Honora could be frightened off it. That was the line that finished him, not that he had lied, for London forgave lies, but that he had lied on commission, cheaply, and lost. The attorneys' coffee-houses, which forgive much, do not forgive a man who makes them look as though they keep low company, and Caudle found his letters unanswered, and his name a thing said, with a particular small smile, and Sleek found the clergyman he had slandered was cousin to a bishop, and between the bishop's displeasure and the Duke's promised and now delivered ruin of his name, he removed himself. The household heard, to practice in a town where the story had not yet come, which is the migration of the exposed in every age. They were not punished. They were merely and finally made unwelcome, which for men whose whole trade is welcome is the one punishment that bites. So the world was set right, on paper and in the drawing rooms both, and it is a strange thing, and Honora had not expected it, that the setting right was the easiest part, and what came after was the hard one. For she had spent 13 years making herself into a woman who did not want, who kept her grief on the far side of a line and never crossed to it, who arranged her whole soul as she arranged a still room, every feeling labelled and stoppered and set in its place where it could spill on no one, and now the line was gone. She was lawful. She was named. She was, by the memorandum and the entails failing in default of other issue, a considerable heiress in fact, with a fortune the Duke's own lawyers were busy restoring to her, so that for the first time in her life she would owe no one her bread. And she found she did not know how to be a person who was owed something. she found she still flinched from the warm rooms, as from a fire she had no right to, still rose when the Duke entered, though he had asked her a dozen times to keep her seat, still when Susan brought her tea unbidden. Felt the old reflex of the throat that said you must not be waited on, you are the one who waits. The grief she could now afford to feel, she found she had half forgotten how to feel, and the wanting she was now permitted, she had so long forbidden that it came back to her crippled, a thing that limped as the Duke limped, and was ashamed of itself. The Duke saw it. He was a man who read everything to the end, and he read this. He did not hurry her. He had courted her, through all the winter of the proving, by attention and not by words, the shared evening reading that had become a fixed hour, the still room visits always with the door wide, and Susan by, the book of waters returned to her with a marker at a page where he had written, small, in the margin, a question about a remedy, so that she must answer him and they must talk, the half-inch bow that had become a real one. The morning he had had the worn South Library set to rights for her, because she had once said, idly, that it was the room in the house she would have chosen to sit in had any room in the house been hers to choose. He had given her, all that while, the one thing no one had given her in 13 years, and the only thing that could have reached her. He had let her be wanted slowly, with no debt attached, asking nothing back that she could not freely keep or freely refuse. And now, in the green-going April, with her fortune restored and her name proven, and every external reason for haste or pressure gone, so that she could not mistake what he did for charity, or for the gilding of a bargain, or for anything but itself, he asked her plainly. He chose the worn South Library and the late afternoon, and he had Susan in the window with her work, plainly visible, because to the last he would do nothing that could be told against her, and he did not kneel. The bad leg would not have let him rise gracefully from it, and he would not court her from a posture he could not hold, and besides, it was not his way. He stood, and he was, for once, not quite level. The closed quiet of him had a tremor under it she had never heard, and it was that tremor, more than any word, that undid the last of her guard. Honora, he said. He had never used the name before. It had always been Miss Harlowe, then Miss Hartley, the careful titles of a careful man. I have a thing to say that I have been a long time learning how to say, and I will say it badly. Because I have had no practice, I learned to give orders, not to ask, and what I have to do now is ask. Your fortune is restored. Your name is your own. You owe this house nothing. If anything, the debt runs the other way, and always will. And I have given Penhallow instruction that it be paid you to the last farthing whatever you answer me, so that you will hear what I say next, standing on your own ground, and not on mine. I want that understood before I say the rest, because I will not have you answer me as a woman without other choices. You have choices now. You have, I would have, you know. Every choice. He stopped. His hand had closed on the back of a chair. And having given you all of them, I find I am asking you, of your own free will, with nothing owing on either side, to make the one choice that would. And here the level voice failed him at last, wholly, and he said the rest of it plain and rough and unadorned, the way a wounded man says the truth. To marry me. Not the heiress, not my cousin's proven daughter, though I am glad past speaking that you are she. You, the grey woman at the end of the line who told me she was the keeper of accounts, and whom I have not, from that hour to this, been able to stop reading. I am asking. You may say no, and I will see you settled, and want for nothing, and never trouble you again. But I am asking. And Honora stood in the worn library that she had once said, idly she would have chosen, and felt her grief come up out of the long-kept place on the far side of the line, but not as grief now. She felt it cross over and become its other self, the thing it had always been the shadow of, the wanting she had forbidden herself for 13 years, because to want was to be hurt, and she had hurt. Enough, and she let it come, all of it, across the line at last, into the warm room, where for the first time in her life it would cost no one anything that she should feel it. She did not answer him with the inheritance, which he had already given away. She did not answer him with gratitude, which he had been at such pains to make impossible. She answered him with the one thing she had never in her life been able to give to any soul, because she had never till that hour been permitted to own it. She answered him with her wanting. Plainly, "Your Grace," she said, and her voice was not level, and she did not try to make it so. For 13 years I taught myself not to want anything, because everything I might have wanted belonged to someone else, and I was the one who kept the books and did not appear in them. You have asked me, of all the things in the world, for the one thing that has always been mine to give, and that no one ever asked for. Yes, not the fortune, not my name, though I will keep that now, having waited so long for it. The asking. I want. And she had to stop, the word so strange in her mouth, 13 years strange. I want to be asked, and I want to answer, and my answer is yes, and I find I have wanted to say it since the day you stopped at the end of a line and looked at a grey woman and asked, as though it could matter, what lady that was. And he crossed the room to her then, the bad leg and all, at the slow, even pace it set, which was the only pace he had, and which she found she would not have changed for any other man's swiftness, and he took her 2 hands in his, not more, with Susan by the window. And that was all. And it was everything. The banns were read 3 Sundays running in the parish where her birth had once stood entered in the column of the base born, and the incumbent, a young man newly come who had read the corrected register with his own eyes, read them out in a clear, glad voice. Between Adam Henry Vaucourt, Duke of Carrow and of Rayshome in this county, bachelor, and Honora Rayshome Hartley. Of this parish, spinster, Rayshome, for she had asked, quietly, that her father's name stand in hers, not in reproach now, but in the having back of what had been kept from her. And the Duke had answered that it should stand first if she wished it, that no woman should go to her wedding stripped of the name that had been her due since the 4th of October 1788. And before the first reading the old entry of her baptism was set right, by the bishop's own faculty, the blank column filled at last in a fair new hand with the name that the memorandum and the marriage line and the silversmith's mark had proven, Father Silas Rayshome, the lie of the blank not scratched out, for the law does not let the past be unwritten, but corrected beneath in the manner the law allows, so that any who turn to that page in the years to come would read both the long silence and the late truth together, which is, Honora thought when she saw it, the honest way of it, for the silence had been real and had cost her a life, and the truth had been real and had given it back, and a register that showed only the one or only the other would have been a lie of a different kind. They were married in May, in the small grey church, without the great London crowd the Duke could have commanded, and neither of them wanted. Lady Sabine stood up with them and wept exactly 1 tear, which from Lady Sabine was a flood. Mrs. Brooke, who had brought a nameless child in out of the rain in the spring of 1789 and kept the little she knew of it locked behind her white lips for 30 years, gave the bride away at the chancel step in the absence of any man with the right, and her hand shook on Honora's arm, and she said, very low, as she put her into the Duke's keeping, "Your mother would be glad, my lady." She asked it. She only asked it. And Honora carried, that day, not flowers alone, but tucked into the worn old Bible that had been one of the 4 things she owned the night she counted her whole estate on the eve of the Duke's coming. The silver and coral rattle, the christening gift bought and paid for in the autumn of 1789 by a father who could not say her name. Carried it up the aisle as the one true witness left of the wanting that had stood at the beginning of her, before the blank column, before the line-ups, before the 13 years, and after, in the still room she would not give up even as a duchess, she set it not back in its hiding, but openly on the shelf among her labelled waters, an heirloom now and not a secret. To be given one day to a child of hers who would be entered in no register's column of the base, whose name would be written plain on the day of its birth and never once kept blank, and who would never, not for 1 hour of its life, have to teach its grief to wait on the far side of any line at all. And so it was, in the end, that the keeper of the books who had once, in her own fair hand, by candlelight, on Lady Day in the year 1819, set herself down at the bottom of her master's household wage book among the cook and the dairymaid and the boy who scared the rooks. Honora Rashombe, no wage set down, board only. Written so because there was no other line in all that careful book in which a base-born clerk, who was secretly a daughter, could be made to appear, became, by the patient steady asking of the wounded man who one February morning read that single line aloud, not knowing what he read, and so read it truer than 13 years of silence had let it be read, and who would not let it lie, and would not let her go south, and would not buy a clean title with a buried sister, and stood with his back turned to a lawyer's threat and his hand held out to a grey woman in front of the whole hall, became, before that year was out, the Duchess of Carrow, and the mistress of the very rooms she had once flinched from as fires she had no right to warm at, and became too, which she had wanted longer and more secretly than ever she had let herself know, the lawful and the named and the at last owned daughter that her father, in the week of his dying, with 3 browned words across her dead mother's unanswered letter, had asked of God the forgiveness for having so long, so shamefully, and so very nearly, but by the grace of one read line and one man who read it, not quite, not in the end, not forever, too late refused her.